is an abridged excerpt from Tracks, which is coming out in June. It's called One Last Hit. Charlie hovered at the back of the train's passenger car, watching people in their seats. There was one person in particular he wanted to keep his eye on, Gene Silverman. Charlie walked past him and found his own seat, but continued to scan the car as a pretense for keeping track of his target. He had until Chicago to do the job. He'd wait until the rural flatlands of Indiana to confront him. When he got this job done, that would be it. He'd be out. It would be enough for him to retire on. Charlie wasn't born into organized crime. He'd sought it out. As the only child of a family living in a little Italy row house, he wasn't poor, but he had relatively humble beginnings that pointed to him becoming the manager of an ethnic grocery store or dry cleaner. His father was Italian and his mother was an immigrant from the Soviet Union. Some weeks they went to Catholic Mass. Other times they ventured out to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on Eastern Avenue. They were all pretty much the same as Charlie saw it. Some of the saints were different, but they taught the same core values. It didn't matter who you were or what you did. One church or another, one line of work or another, one ethnicity or another. Life was all pretty much what you made of it. He decided early on to make his big. He started small. He got the idea when he was barely a teenager. Midsummer days were long and pointless, and even the promise of school seemed a welcome vacation from idleness. He spent his days roaming through the streets of Federal Hill, the other side of the harbor, where people had money. On a telephone pole, he saw a flyer with a picture of an ugly pug, contact information, and a reward amount, $100. Back then, that was a lot of money, more than Charlie had ever seen. He spent the better part of the next few days playing pet detective, searching between row houses, in the parks, along the streets, and in the alleyways. On the third day of his search, he surprised himself when, by luck more than skill, he discovered the dog tied to a post outside one of the pubs along Charles Street. He unhitched it and ran to the first payphone he could find. "I found your dog," Charlie cried. "Oh, you must have the wrong dog. We found Cooper day before yesterday." Charlie was pissed. All of the work with no payoff. He kicked the dog. It yelped. Then he got the idea to keep the dog and hold it for ransom. Sure enough, in a few days, new flyers replaced the old. A picture he'd not have noticed was any different, but certainly new contact information. And a new amount, $200. He called the number. "That's great," the woman at the other end of the line gave their address, just a few blocks over. The dog was exchanged for the money, and as easily as that, Charlie found himself richer than he'd ever been before. Charlie ate ice cream, took water taxis, stocked up on girly magazines, even conned himself some beer, whiskey, and cigarettes. The money lasted him a luxurious couple weeks. Then he schemed for more. He managed to coax a collie out of the park on the hill and let it out of sight, then fit it to the leash he carried with him. A few days later, he exchanged the lost dog for $150. The rewards varied from a disappointing thank you and a piece of pie to an overwhelming $5,000. By the end of the summer, he had more money stashed in his sock drawer than his parents had under their mattress. Fells Point was only a short walk from Little Italy. There was a lot of action in Fells Point with all of the pubs and clubs, the Broadway market, the restaurants. He began hanging out in the area when he wasn't stealing and saving rich people's pets. When the local drug dealers tried to sell to him, he offered to sell for them. His ambition met with success. Before he knew it, he was pushing more drugs at school than some of the adult dealers were selling on the street. At 16, Charlie became the youngest member of the local organized crime ring, and he discovered that there was a lot more money in dealing drugs than pets. In those days, he learned to read people. He could spot an undercover cop by the cool, guarded caution. He could weed out a narc by the fearful twitch. He knew the users from the curious by how quickly they took their purchases. Sometimes, when he stood along Broadway Market and the adjoining streets, he watched proud people strutting by and wanted to beat the shit out of them. Sometimes he did. Once, after a college kid threatened to tell the cops he was dealing, Charlie took things a little too far. Fortunately for Charlie, it was in an unpopulated alley, and no one saw who had beaten the poor kid to death. Guilt nearly drove Charlie out of the business altogether, but his ambition overshadowed his guilt. The boss found out. His spies were everywhere, and he summoned Charlie. "You have a real talent for clean, dirty work." Most of the jobs the boss gave him were just warnings: broken limbs, smashed faces, roughing up. But there were occasional hits. Charlie found it less difficult to deal with the second time around, and by his third kill, it came easily. He was sly, quick, and quiet about his work. He taught himself not to care, not to hear the pleas or cries. It wasn't long before he'd become the boss's hitman of choice. Charlie didn't enjoy it, but he was good at it, and the money couldn't be beat. Years later, he went his own way. He'd had enough of the violence and no longer wanted to be a full-time thug. He parted with the understanding that he would still be called upon for favors that, when well done, would be well compensated. After accepting this job, they'd gone to the boss's smoking lounge. There was something intimate about it. Aside from the feeling of a woman's body next to his, it didn't get much better than the feeling of a joint passed from one person to another. "I gotta go check on the boys," the boss said. "They ought to be out on the streets by now." "Come on, one last hit," Charlie offered, pushing the joint in his direction. "The problem is, it never is the last hit," the boss said. "It's always supposed to be the last one, but it never is unless you make it that way." On the train, Charlie wanted to sleep now, but he couldn't allow it. Intuitively, he looked back at Silverman, his internal clock tuned into his environment. Silverman had put away his paper and was snapping the latches of his briefcase. Then he stood and walked toward the front of the car. Charlie turned discreetly around and watched Silverman exit. He stood and followed Silverman. Finally, his target entered the lounge car. Charlie stalled, buffering their entries with time. In the lounge, Charlie ordered a black coffee. He wanted a bourbon. He wanted to get off at the next stop and smoke a cigarette, but he knew he had to stay right here with his target. He still had a long wait for the flatlands of Middle Indiana. Then he could get off in Chicago before anyone had even found the body. One last hit, then there would be no more violence. Charlie studied people to pass the time. These people, all in their own little worlds, some of them intermingling, others completely isolated and unaware of their traveling companions, unaware of him and his intruding eyes. Charlie wondered where they came from and where they were headed. Most people went through life clueless. They had no idea they were being watched, scrutinized, whether by a guy like him or a con man, a telemarketer or a boss. Most people were oblivious to the dangers all around them. But that wasn't Charlie's concern. Only one destiny concerned Charlie. Silverman had to die before this train reached Chicago. That's the end.